been the topic of conversation, and so I'm going to throw this into a video and then put it out on the internet. Hockey changes all the time. So what we're going through right now is the first massive change in the game that is happening at light speed right in front of our eyes with social media driving everything, right? So it's different, but hockey's changing all the time, and it feels like the way that players are being treated is changing, but the players themselves have changed. And the debate over why or who's responsible, it really doesn't matter. It's a change that's going to happen. And I want to look at this from a penalty minutes perspective, because that gives you a good feeling of how much the game itself on the ice has changed. Currently, your leader in penalty minutes is Nick Ritchie with 54. He's on pace for about 160, maybe 170. 2017-2018, Michael Haley had 212 penalty minutes. That is the last time a player has hit 200 penalty minutes in a season. 2010-2011, Zenon Konopka hit 307 penalty minutes. That's the last time a player hit 300. 2001-2002, Peter Worrell hit 354. That's the last time a player hit 350. 91-92, Mike Peluso had 408, which I think is third on the all-time list. 81-82, Paul Baxter had 409. 74-75, Dave Schultz had 472, which works out to roughly, 8 per game or 7 per game? Like, it's a lot. And that's basically a fight per game. But hockey wasn't like that before the Broad Street Bullies. And here's a good example. 1967-68, Barclay Plager and Don Oury had the highest total of penalty minutes with 153 each. So this era that we went through, where there was a lot of fighting and tough guys and all this, the NHL wasn't like that before that. If you look season by season penalty minutes, and I went through a hockey reference for this, it's fascinating to see there was this time where, 400, 300, 350, there were a lot of guys who would record penalty minutes like that. But in the 60s and previous decades, that wasn't a thing. So what we're going into right now, where a lot of people say, these hockey players these days are coddled, and, back in my day. Well, yes, but hockey wasn't like that in the 60s. So it was something we went through. The Philadelphia Flyers changed the way that hockey worked, and offense became absolutely insane coming around during that era. And it may very well be that when you get into this era of huge penalty minutes, maybe defense isn't as big a deal. Maybe coaching was a little different back then too. And maybe in the 60s what they were coaching for defense, they weren't coaching in the 70s and early 80s. And maybe the players were more talented. Whatever reasons the game changed, it changed dramatically. Where you could have 80 points and be one of the top 10 scorers. In the 60s, you could be top 5 even. And then in the 80s, you could have 80 points and you're barely even a top 6 forward. So things changed dramatically. Now, if you look at fights, in 2018-2019, last season, we saw 16% of games have fights in them. And 22 games for the season had more than one. In 2008-2009, 10 years before, 41% of games had fights in them. And that number's pretty consistent from then and before then, right back to 2000-2001. 173 games had more than one fight. And I guarantee those numbers were higher in the 80s and in the 70s. A fight was pretty much guaranteed in almost every game that I watched in the 80s, but so were scores of 6-4, 7-5, that kind of thing, and goaltenders being about 5'6" and 150 pounds. So the game changes. These were changes that took place over a lengthy period for the most part, minus the Broad Street Bullies changing the game rather quickly. But again, in the 70s, how many people were watching that on TV? How many were listening to it on the radio? Did you get your information from the local newspaper? Like, it was a completely different everything. All-time penalty minutes leader is Tiger Williams with 3,971. The current leader is 60th on the all-time list. That's Zdeno Chara with 1,918. And the next player who's active and has played a game this year with penalty minutes is Joe Thornton at 254th with 1,232. And then next up is 295th overall, David Backes with 1,138. We will never see a player hit 3,000 penalty minutes again. It'll never happen. And the game has fundamentally changed. So this is why when people talk about, and go back to the video I did yesterday on Marchand, Marsh, dirtiest player ever. No. The game has fundamentally changed to the point where when a player does something dirty, we see it from 8 different angles, and then we react to it in a way that's just completely different. And the NHL itself will suspend guys for things that back in the 80s wouldn't have even batted an eye. It wouldn't have done anything. Would have been, the answer to everything was keep your head up. Keep your head up. And then if the guy's head was up, it was, he should have had his head down there. His head was too high in that one. It's always the head. The one thing that we don't protect until we have to. Now, I wanted to look at nationalities too, because this is where the league is kind of fascinating. Right now, in the season we're playing, 370 Canadians have already played. So that number is going to go up as season debuts happen, injuries take place, guys get called up. Americans 212, Swedes 96, Russians 44, Finns 43, Czechs 30, Swiss, there's 13 Swiss players that have played at least a game this year. Slovakians 11, Germans 8, and the Danes 7. Now, when you look at this compared to 10 years ago, Canada had 515. Keep in mind that number is going to go up for Canada because there's going to be more players debuting during this season. U.S. had 212 for the season. So that's going to be a higher number than it was then. Swedes had 54. Right now it's 96. And the number one complaint Don Cherry used to have back in the day was Swedes this and Swedes that and Swedes, and this is going to ruin the game. It has definitely impacted the game when you consider that 96 Swedes, that's an average of about 3 per team. So where you could look back, 20 years especially, and we'll talk about that, and you'd have 1 or 2 Swiss players on a team at most. Now there's a lot. There were 48 Czechs at that point. Now we're at 30. The amount of Czech players in the NHL definitely seems to have dropped off. Finns, 38. We're already at 43 right now. Russians, 34. We're at 44 already. Slovakians, 18. We're at 11. So both Czech and Slovak, which used to be Czechoslovakia, the numbers have definitely changed, and it's been a downturn for them. Germans, 8. So we'll likely see more than 8 this season. Danes, there were 6. Right now there's 7. Swiss, there were 5. Now it's 13. So more Swiss players in the NHL as well. And when you look at 99-2000, there were 0 Swiss players in the NHL 20 years ago. 526 Canadians. 150 Americans. So the American content in the NHL has gone up. I have stated for many, many years that would change the NHL greatly. They play very similar style of hockey to Canadians, yes, but it does change things. Russians, 71. So there were more Russians playing in the league 1999-2000 than there is now. KHL's made a difference there. Czechs, 56. Swedes, 46. Finns, 26. Slovakians, 19. Latvians, there were 7. Now I don't see any on this board. Germans, 6. Ukrainians, there were 3. So there has been a change to the demographics. You've got more Swiss than you had back then. You've actually got less Russians than we had back then. Less Czechs and less Slovakians. That may be because of the KHL as well. And more Swedes. So the Swedes, who are known for playing a skill game, there's more of them in the league now, by about twice as many as there was 20 years ago. This is what a lot of people were worried about 20 years ago. You got too many Swedes on your team. You can't win with them. You can't win with Swedes. You'd hear it. And I always thought it was ridiculous. I'm like, what are you talking about? And then it was, well, you have to have a Canadian captain. And then Detroit won with Nick Lidstrom as captain. And that was, well, yeah, but look at all the Canadians on the Red Wings. So, there's all those Canadian players. It wasn't really Lidstrom when Lidstrom was the best defenseman of his generation. Now, Rick Tocchet was talking today, and there are conversations to be had about this, about how coaching now is a partnership between the coach and the players. So the conversations that we would have between coaches and players back here is more of a, all right, you guys go do what I tell you to do or else you're benched. And now it's more of a coach going in and going, all right, guys, what do we need to do here? Here's what I think. Here's my idea. I would love to hear input from you guys. There are a lot of great Hall of Fame coaches. There's no way would have gone into a room and said, all right, input from everybody. They may have gone to select leaders on the team and gone, all right, Guy Lafleur, what do you think? What do you think? And, he may have, off the record, given him some options and some ideas and whatnot. Now it's more of a team partnership kind of thing. And there's some speculation that with what's going on with some of the coaches in the National Hockey League, teams may look to Europe. So we were talking a year ago about how European coaches don't really come over. We've got Ralph Kruger currently with Buffalo. He had coached in North America before. But, maybe there is something to this, that maybe bringing in a different voice and a different opinion. And I think where all of this changing with culture of the hockey. So we've gone through this era where we had bullies. You had guys playing 3 minutes a game. They dressed this guy. Why'd they dress him? Well, just for fights. So if he was on the ice, you knew it was going to be a fight. I'm not saying the names because if you watched hockey back then, you knew what the job was for these guys. If they're on the ice, a fight is coming. So then the other team would put their goon out there, and then the fight's coming. And next thing you know, there was some big brawl, or the two of them would have a fight that would go on for about 45 seconds while the crowd went crazy. That's kind of gone out of the game. And so the way that you coach the players has to change as well. And I think there are some coaches who may very well be, used to the kind of player they had back then, and it's a different player now. And I don't think it means that it's a softer player. I've seen that a lot. But you know what? This is where me being older may come in, or I'm older than a lot of people. The reason I'm wearing my Gretzky jersey, I'm wearing my Gretzky Oilers. One of two Gretzky Oilers that I have. My grandfather, he would go on rants. He would watch a hockey game. He would watch the Oilers. He would watch them against Montreal or whoever. He would rant about the Oilers and how they were destroying the game. They couldn't play defense. That's why they would never win a Stanley Cup. Gretzky was useless. If he had played in Gordie Howe's era, he wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. All these points he's putting up, it's because these teams just are lousy, and it's not that he's any good. He would talk about all these great players from the past. Now they were so much better, and these hockey players today, they don't know what real hockey is, and they would rant and rant and rant. So when I see some of the comments I see here on the channel, when I see them on Sportsnet or TSN, I think, it's the spirit of my grandfather right there. That's what that is. Because this is what I've heard for decades. That's it. We've ruined hockey. That the Russians are coming. The Soviet Union's busted. All the Russians are coming. That's it. That's going to ruin hockey. I remember that conversation too. The Russians are going to ruin the game forever. Then Bure lands in Vancouver and everybody forgets all about it. But that was the conversation, was how this was going to ruin it. That's it. This is going to be the end of fighting, people say, as if like taking fighting out of the game is going to make it worse. When again, we've been shown throughout the decades, all right, that here we go, it's big fight time ever since Broad Street Bullies. But before them, that wasn't a part of the game. So the game has evolved. Every decade, something's different. And while we have this discussion of race, which is there, it's part of it, there are players at every level. And I thought it was interesting with Anson Carter on Hockey Night in Canada, where he said he was interviewed before the draft. And the scout that talked to him from the Maple Leafs said, well, why aren't you getting into basketball? Well, what if you decide to get into basketball? And his answer was, I don't want to play basketball. Why are you asking me about basketball? And there's an obvious reason you would ask him. And then Anson Carter, clearly still ticked off decades later, he was getting passed over in the draft for guys who never made it, who he knew he was better than from playing against them. And he felt they were passing on him because he might play basketball. So there was a bias then. I think there's some, and in some cases it may just be something we're not conscious of, where we'd look out and go, hey, it's interesting, you play hockey, huh? A guy like you, I figured you'd play football or basketball, and you don't play cricket? I would think you'd play cricket. So, we're having this conversation now, and I think it is important in this day and age, as we've seen the demographic already shift, where Canadians used to be by far the dominant nationality in the game. That's no longer the case. Canadians now make up less than 50% of the players. I don't have to do the math. I can see it's less than 50% of the players. It's still the largest group, but that standing could change as well over the next 10 years. With the American programs that they've got in place, and I've always said, with the U.S., the population in the U.S. is about 10 times the population in Canada. If we ever saw a movement in the States towards hockey rather than another sport, they would likely swamp Canada in terms of numbers, and we would see a huge shift. And for me, I just want to see the best players. So for me personally, I don't care. I don't care where the player comes from. I don't care about the background as much as I care about, is this the best player? And with the whole fighting argument, well, this guy's a fighter, but is he a good player? Can he skate? And that's where the conversation, when that came into the game, and we realized rolling 4 lines was really important. And I think that originated with the New Jersey Devil teams that, not only had trapping hockey, the trap that just killed the game for a while there, the dead puck era, but you had Brodeur in net for 70-plus games, and they rolled 4 lines. They always rolled 4 lines. And they proved you need a 4th line. If up until then you had 3 lines, and then you had your 4th line, which was, they might get 4 minutes a night. And that doesn't work anymore. So now when we see a player getting 4 or 5 minutes in a game, we're like, well, why'd they even dress that guy? He only got 4 minutes. Whereas 20 years ago, yeah, that guy got 2 minutes. But boy, I tell you, he picked a fight when he got out there, didn't he? We're going to see massive shifts in things, and there will be players who end up getting in some issues for things that they've said. And we've seen that over the years. That has been a thing where players have been punished for things they've said on the ice or off the ice. And now we're seeing coaches go through that as well. But the game, as it's changed completely in its nationalities, in how the game is played, I even thought about throwing up scoring stats to show how in the 70s it went up, 80s it went up even further, and then in the 90s it nosedived before it recovered after we lost a whole year to the lockout. And we're seeing now that goals per game on average per team right now is at 3.04, which is a little bit higher than it was last year, and it's the highest it's been since that season after the lockout. 05-06 was a crazy year. I think hockey players were just glad to be back on the ice playing National Hockey League hockey, and that was why we saw so much scoring. And not only that, but we had new rules to deal with, so it took a while for coaches to figure out how to nullify some of that offense. When 2006, 2007 rolled around, a lot of that offense came back out, where coaches were better prepared for new things. When they took the center line out, that made a big difference. You allowed 2-line passes. I can remember when they didn't. Which is why when people say, well, back in the 80s, well, yeah, but back in the 80s you couldn't make a 2-line pass either. Just imagine if that Oilers team in the 80s had been able to make 2-line passes. Holy crap. That would have been absolutely insane. They weren't playing defense as it was. Allow a 2-line pass. They're never in their own zone. So it is a changing game. And every single step of the way, every single change, hockey resists. Every single change, fans throw their hands in the air and go, that's it, I'm done, I'm never going to watch hockey again. That's it, I'm finished. Hockey's finished. Even, like I said, the 2-line pass, there were people who complained at the time, this is just going to ruin the game. Now it's just going to be just guys cherry picking all the time. It's going to be terrible. This is awful. Leave it in there. Why are we changing it? And when I talk about how they may change the offside rule and they may make it so that as long as your skate breaks the plane, who cares if your foot's on the ice or not? People say, no, you got to leave that alone. You got to leave the offside alone. That rule hasn't been changed in years. Even though when it was designed, they didn't have replay cameras and they didn't have this inch-by-inch, moment-by-moment replay. They couldn't have envisioned this happening. I can't see them looking at it and going, well, it has to be, within millimeters, and we can do a replay, because they wouldn't have that back then. So yeah, the game does change. It will continue to change, and I just think what we're dealing with right now is probably because it's societal and because of social media, it's going to happen faster. It's just going to happen faster. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.